Well, welcome to Searching the Sacred. I am Steph here with Lisa. We are the two folks who are in the room right now who are normally in the room for the Searching the Sacred podcast, but we are excited to be here with a different kind of season. This season, we are going to be talking about women that are represented in the sacred texts of multiple traditions, specifically in the Quran, in the Hebrew scriptures, and in the Christian Bible. And we are going to be talking with women from multiple traditions about how we see, experience, and what we've heard about these women, and just embark on the adventure of a multi-faith conversation. And so we are really thrilled to have some special guests with us here today who are going to be reading from those texts in their tradition. So we're going to start with a reading of those texts, and then we are going to have each person who is here introduce themselves to you. So we are going to begin. Listen to these words from different sacred texts.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لقد كان في قصصهم عبرة لأولي الألباب. ما كان حديثا يفترى ولكن تصديق الذي بين يديه وتفصيل كل شيء وهدى ورحمة لقوم يؤمنون. This that I read is the ayah, or you can call it verse, in the section of Surah Yusuf, in the story of Joseph. It's chapter 12. And it says, in their stories, there is truly a lesson for people of reason. This message cannot be a fabrication. Rather, it is a confirmation of previous revelations, a detailed explanation of all things, a guide, a mercy for people of faith.
This is a selection from Genesis chapter 39, verses 7 through 10. I'll chant it first in the Hebrew and then read a translation. Vayehi har hadvarim hayda vatisa eshet Adonav et eineha el Yosef vatomer shichva imi vayemae Vayomer Elishat Adonav Ein Adoni lo yada iti ma b'bayit v'chol asher yesh bo natan biyadi Einenu gadol b'bayit hazeh ממני ולא חשב ממני מאומה כי אם אותך כאשר את אשתו ואיך אעשה הרעה הגדולה הזאת וחטאתי לאלוהים ויהי כדברה אל יוסף יום יום ולא שמע אליה לשכב אצלה להיות עמה. After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. He said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here my master gives no thought to anything in this house, and all that he owns he has placed in my hands. He wields no more authority in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me, except yourself, since you are his wife. How then could I do this most wicked thing and sin before God?" And much as she coaxed Joseph day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie beside her, to be with her.
I'll be reading from Genesis 39, and I will read the following verses after what Rabbi Tamar read. And all I have is English. So this is verses 11 through 18. One day in the Common English Bible. translation. One day when Joseph arrived at the house to do his work, none of the household's men were there. She grabbed his garment, saying, "Lie down with me." But he left his garment in her hands and ran outside. When she realized that he had left his garment in her hands and run outside, she summoned the men of her house and said to them, "Look, my husband brought us a Hebrew to ridicule us. He came to me to lie down with me, but I screamed. When he heard me raise my voice and scream, he left his garment with me and ran outside." She kept his garment with her until Joseph's master came home, and she told him the same thing. "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us to ridicule me came to me, but when I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment with me and ran outside."
Thank you, everyone. I was thinking as I heard all of those, there's a woman named Barbara Bond Taylor who wrote a book called Holy Envy. And I was feeling very envious of chanting and singing in other traditions than my own because of how rich that felt. So thank you for bringing that to us. So we're going to now introduce ourselves. So that was an introduction of who we were talking about today is going to be Potiphar's wife and her intersection with the story of Joseph from these different traditions. So we're going to now hear who it was that you just heard reading and singing and what tradition they are coming from. So if you would, please share your name, what tradition you are a part of, and if you have a role that you play with that tradition that you would like to share. And then what, if anything, you grew up hearing about the woman that we are talking about today, Potiphar's wife.
So, greetings of peace. I am Talat Alia Siddiqui. I'm a Muslima belonging to the faith tradition of Islam. And you can look me up as Coach Alia on the social media. I came to know about this podcast through my Rabbi community. I've done a teacher certification from the Rabat Academy. Now they're going to be a university, so I'm looking forward to joining them. And growing up, I wasn't much of an observant of Islam growing up, so I don't have, much to recall. As an adult, though, I've been inspired to learn about women in history, not only Islamic history, but any women who defied the odds in their times. Initially, I was inspired by my father's book. He wrote a little booklet called Misconceptions About Women in Islam. And after that, I've done my own digging. And of course, the Rabat Academy helped. And now I'm an avid student of knowledge, I should say. And that's where my interest comes in. I'm a history buff, plus the, faith of Islam, and really learning about Muslim women and just women in general, and how they have stood against the odds, defied in some cases, or stood, true to themselves. So that's been my inspiration.
Thank you.
I'm Rabbi Tamar Magill-Grimm, and I am the Senior Rabbi at Beth Jacob Congregation, which is in Mendota Heights, Minnesota. I have my ordination from Hebrew College in Boston, which is a trans-denominational rabbinical school, which means that it is not affiliated with any of the major movements, and our learning was with students who identify with various movements or with no movement, and so a pluralistic school. And I met Stephanie at the Minnesota Multi-Faith Conference this year, and that's how I heard about this podcast. I'm really thrilled to get to participate and to meet all of you.
And did you grow up hearing anything about Potiphar's wife?
Not that I can recall. I don't think this is one of the stories that we learned about in Hebrew school. So, of course, I encountered it later in life. I don't, because I didn't encounter it as a child, I don't know that there was like an evolution per se.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
My name is Rachel Pye Jones, and I am a Christian. I was raised in a Baptist evangelical home, and I refer to myself now as living in the aftermath of evangelicalism. Kind of not quite fully post, and not quite fully ex, but sort of wrestling with what that brought to my life and what I'm jettisoning and what I'm keeping. I am currently a PhD student at Fuller Seminary, which is an evangelical seminary, but has a very ecumenical kind of broad sources that they draw from and study with. And my specific area of study is Islamic studies, because I spent 20 years living in the Horn of Africa, where my major community was Muslim majority Somalis, and my own faith was utterly transformed in positive ways from that experience. And so that is what draws me to this particular conversation, because the things that I've learned about God and scripture and a life of faith have been so strengthened by interreligious dialogue. And what I've learned, especially about these women, how reading about them in Islamic traditions has really, and also in some more Jewish traditions, has informed my understanding of what I had learned previously. And so, yeah, in particular with Potiphar's wife, that was one of the first women that I realized had such a significant story in the Quran, and it's fascinating and different to what I had grown up hearing. And so that made me really curious to have these kinds of conversations, whether it's in academics or with people like this. And I grew up hearing, the only thing I was ever taught really about this story was that, well, two things, I guess. Look, here's what happens when a woman has sexual desire. It's all bad. And that was like the whole thing about her, was that she just wanted to sleep with Joseph because he was handsome. And so you better not have desire, ladies, was kind of the lesson. And that was about it. And then also, look what happens when a woman lies about a sexual experience. So she had, changed the story from what happened. And it was just very negative. And that's not what I think the story is teaching now. I'm not super sure, so I would love to learn from others about how you understand it now and what you've learned now. But I think that the story is a lot more complicated than that.
Thanks, Rachel. And Rachel just gets an extra shout out because this whole entire podcast series is really inspired by Rachel's curiosity about these women. And then Lisa, who's also here, who should introduce herself, was like, we should do a podcast series on that. And so thanks, Rachel, for being our inspiration.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn.
Well, everybody knows who I am who listens to the podcast.
Well, you can still say hi so that they know you're here.
I am here. Yet. I'm still here. It's Lisa, the other half of 40 Orchards. And if this is your first time listening, I'm oftentimes the voice of someone who spends a lot of time with folks who are incarcerated or post-incarceration. That is it's the place I love to spend a lot of time. And so I try to take the wisdom and learnings that I have from working with them and bring that into the conversations around sacred text.
Which is, I think that's a great relevant story to share as we intersect with the story of Joseph, because after this story, he becomes imprisoned. And so this is a part of a story of someone's imprisonment and what this woman's role was or wasn't in that, and how that affects how we hear the story of Joseph as well. I would love to just open it up for us to just start dialoguing about what we see and hear and think today. So this could be something that we've started to think about over the last several years that we can bring in, or it could just be something that struck us this morning as we are listening to these passages and wondering about them. So like this, in preparation for this conversation, when I was looking at the passage, I thought, gosh, it actually seems pretty unusual to have an assertive female like this in the sacred text. Like, I don't think there are many characters like her that I have encountered in the Bible. And so that made me curious about that story existing. I didn't really have a conclusion. I was just like, this makes me curious. It feels very unique to have that role, and what is and isn't being said through a woman having that role. That was one of the things I was thinking about this morning. So I'm just curious. We don't have to go in order anymore. So any thoughts anyone has today as you're intersecting with this story, questions, curiosities, insights about this woman.
I must say that, Lisa, when you talked about, your passion and what you usually do on these podcasts, immediately I was like, wow, what a relevance that, Yusuf or Joseph was incarcerated right after this incident. So very interesting. And just to clarify, I know that you are introducing the story as Potiphar's wife, and in the Islamic tradition or in the Quran, we don't know the name of this person. He's referred to as the Aziz, which is anybody who's in very high status. So he could be the minister, or he could be the governor, or somebody high up in status. And we don't even know her name. She's referred to in the ayat as the Aziz's wife, or the wife. The name Zuluikha, it comes from the Hebrew tradition, and that's how we learned it, that she was called Zuleika or Zuleika.
Is the story otherwise? Is there similarities where it would be the same sense of a female desire pursuing Yosef?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that other stories in the Quran, they're in bits and pieces in different sections. So like, Moses' story is in different sections, or Adam's story is in different sections, but Yusuf or Joseph's story is the only one that is all in one section, and it is in chronological order from the time he was a child and, till the time he became the minister in the Egyptian kingdom. So it's very interesting that this story, or this woman, was, I was listening to Rachel, that she heard about like how women could be so bad, and when I read the story, yes, of course, it's very interesting that the Quran lays out the events like so explicitly, and in other places it's not as explicit. The stories are more like you're learning from it, from a moral perspective, or some things are left out, but this one, it's like it's in the same chapter that I was reading. I was reading the end of it, the ending ayah, and about how the stories are relayed to us to learn from. But it starts somewhere, I think, ayah 21, and that this man who is Egyptian, he bought Yusuf alayhi salam as a slave boy. He brings him home and brings it to his wife and says that, here, it's a good boy, and he can be helpful to you in the house. So we immediately can tell that she is older, but she doesn't have children of her own. So he's kind of given to her as a gift. And then the next ayah, it says when he matures, when he reaches maturity, so whatever that is, he's probably a young teen, that she plans this whole thing out, and I was listening to Rabbi Tamar about how there was nobody in the house and stuff. But in the Quran, it says she locks all the doors. So it's not just one door. She locks all the doors. And then she tells him, hey, like that means just come here. Like, just come here, come to me. It's more of a yelling and a demand. And in the Quran, it's very interesting that Yusuf alayhi salam, he would have gone to her, it says, but he knew better. So he was shown, like he was guided. So he had the guidance. Otherwise, he would have gone to her. So he would have, fell for her. So that tells us that she was probably very beautiful, and, how attractive, I should say. But he had the wisdom to know better. And he says, and it was very interesting to listen to both Rachel and Rabbi Tamar, that Yusuf alayhi salam says that I can't do this because I'm in this house of, my master, who's been so good with me. I mean, he brought me home, and, he's like given me a good living. So I can't do this. And then he turns it to her that, why would you do this? And then in the Quran, it says they both run. So he's running, ahead. He's trying to get away, and she's running after him. So it's very explicitly saying they both run to the door, and she grabs her shirt. She grabs his shirt from behind, but because he's running, the shirt rips. And as they both come to the door, the husband is at the door. And there's, in the Quran, it says there's a witness from the family, and we don't know, who that is, but this witness from the family, of course, the wife is saying, what is going to be the punishment of this, person, because he came on to me. And this witness says, and it's very explicitly in the Quran, that if the shirt is ripped from the front, then he is lying and she is true. But if the shirt is ripped from behind, then he's on truth and she's the one lying.
That's fascinating, because we in the Christian and Hebrew text, there is a similar narrative of something being left behind, but without that detail of the wisdom of how it's ripped as being a part of the story.
Really, it's fascinating.
I would love to add. I mean, you were adding in lots of details from the Quran, which I think is beautiful. And I'm looking at Rabbi Tamar, thinking, I know that you also know a lot of oral Torah, or I'm curious about the Talmud or Hasidic texts, if there's other texts that would come into your understanding of this woman who's in the Bible.
Yeah, so there's so many threads I want to pick up on, but I will answer that question. The Torah also lays this story out, and many of the stories in Genesis, I've been saying this from the Bima, or like the pulpit, these past few weeks. This, by the way, is the Torah reading for this week. So on Saturday during our service,
fascinating,
we're reading this section of Torah out loud and talking about it. The text itself doesn't give us any indication about whether or not Joseph is attracted to her, whether he, is kind of subduing his urge, or whether he has no interest in her and he's just saying, I can't do this, but also like he doesn't want to, maybe, right? So I don't know if you could hear it when I was chanting it, but on the word in Hebrew for refuse, so vayima'en, he refused, there's a special cantillation mark. So you heard me kind of singing it, right? That itself is an interpretive element of the text, right? That we chant it with very specific cantillation that's applied to each word. That word, vayima'en, has a cantillation mark on it called shalshelet, and it goes, and it's a more elaborate, more kind of, it makes you pause on that word. And so a lot of the oral tradition, the oral Torah, around this story has to do with that refusal. Like, why is that cantillation mark there? What is this refusal about? And so some, in Jewish tradition, we have many commentaries, and they often will contradict each other. There isn't sort of one, like, this is the answer, this is what it means, right? But we do have, for example, the Ramban, who's a famous, Nachmanides, a famous commentator, says he refused. He said to his master's wife that even though he feared her, right, because she's in charge of him, right? He has to, in theory, he has to listen to what she says to do. But even though he feared her, he feared God more. Mm-hmm. So that's just an example of one of the ways the oral Torah fills in kind of the missing pieces of the story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, it made me think, when you say that too, one of the things that felt noticeable today is just all of the power dynamics that are in this story of, like, who actually is the person you should follow. Is it your master? Is it your master's wife? Is it your God? And, like, in other stories, I think when it would be a male in this position being the pursuer of a female, you were the slave, you would have to say yes. You wouldn't maybe even have the choice. But here, and so there's an interesting power dynamic in Joseph refusing that feels like it hits at that sort of question. As a modern, more feminist person, I have questions about this ancient text and the power dynamics that are in it, and what we do with that. Rachel,
and why?
Okay.
Can I say one other thing about that? And why is it a forbidden relationship, right? Because if in all the cases where there's a maid servant, a female servant, right, and she's given to the husband as a servant, it's presumed that they're going to have sexual relations, right? And you've got Hagar, you've got Bilhah and Zilpah, right? Like, you've got other characters in the Torah where that's like their role, but clearly here that's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are all the things that are different about this story that it's a different energy towards that power? Rachel, is there anything that you would add maybe even questions that have come up or things from your tradition that are coming into play?
Yeah, I just have so many questions. I would love to dig into all of them, but one thing that I have been kind of wrestling with, and I would love to hear your responses to it, is the idea of her, and I'll call her Zuleika, her desire, and what is desire, and what does that mean, and why does she have it? And in the text, her husband has paid attention to everything except her. He doesn't have to think about the food that he eats, even because Joseph is taking such good care of the household. And then there's also this idea, exactly what you brought up, Rabbi Tamar, about female slaves who come into the household. They are there for their womb, essentially. And then also what Aliyah said of her being a woman without children, it seems like, it's not super clear, but it seems like in the biblical text, she doesn't have any children. So did her husband bring in this Hebrew slave in order to have children? Or did she think of that on her own as, like, here's a way I could actually provide for my household? Maybe that wasn't her husband's intention. I read some scholars wrestling with whether or not Potiphar was potentially a eunuch. And that you would know about that, Rabbi Tamar, the word for it of saris or saris, I'm not really sure in Hebrew, but that
saris,
could potentially, saris, could potentially mean eunuch. So that would then imply that they have no children. And in order for her to protect her legacy, her family, the household, she would need a child. Is that why Joseph was brought in, or is that why she pursued him? Was her desire not just like what I had been taught, to be sexually satisfied as a woman, but was it actually a legitimate, healthy, good desire, which also sexual desire is also healthy and good and legitimate, just to say. But that complicates her role, and instead it makes her more than just a woman of her body and her sex, but a woman with intention and with actually some wisdom, even if she made a questionable choice of how she was going to accomplish this. And then issues of deceit or whatever come into it as well. But that's something that I've been thinking about and how that turns the idea of desire, which has been in my tradition or upbringing kind of made really negative. It turns it into something different and more complicated. And then it opens up the story to talk about infertility or neglect in a marriage, or what actually is appropriate desire, and how do we trust God to accomplish that. All those kinds of things are what I've been sort of wrestling with. Yeah.
Now we have to decide where to go with all those questions, Rachel, because those were all really good questions. I feel like Lisa has some questions too that you've been writing down, or any of them for yet, or should we?
Well, no, I hear Rachel pointing towards desire, but I think we have to hold in there as well, like that this is a woman who has power, and we don't often encounter women who have power inside of the text in the traditional sense of like, this is her slave. So like, then for me, like, I think I have to hold both of those things, because that makes a big difference in the conversation around desire of who has power and what do you do when you have power and desire.
Yeah, and I think Aliyah made that very clear from the Quranic text that her husband, the Aziz, did you say that he actually gave Joseph to his wife and said, "This is a good boy"? Was he for his wife, and especially for her in the Quran?
Yeah, it just says the person from Egypt brings him in and gives it to his wife, but it's not to see the way I understand it, and the way in the tradition, if it's somebody brought to the master, a slave person, this person just becomes like a servant to them. So they would run errands, do everything for them, and just be like a houseboy. That's our understanding of things, and that's why when she does desire him, I'm very curious to find out how the other faith tradition talk about the story right afterwards. Does he is he put in jail right away? Because in Quran, the next ayah talks about the story that follows.
Yeah, so I think the way that this is kind of understood in Jewish tradition, excuse me, is that this is all, orchestrated by God to get Joseph with Pharaoh's servants so that he can interpret their dreams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's sort of this question. It turns out to be that, the end of Genesis has this sense of what Joseph's brothers intended for evil, God intended for good. So there can be a way of reading this as sort of a path laid out by God to get Joseph where he needed to be, to have the influence that he needed to have. That has other questions about what God allows versus what God causes. I think in many traditions, there's sort of that question of God's role in those things, but there's definitely a stream of interpretation that would say this is a part of that pathway that Joseph needed to be on.
Right.
There's really fascinating stories in both texts. And again, Aliyah, you can speak to this from the Quran better than I can, but in Genesis 38, it's the story of Judah and Tamar. And there's some really complicated dynamics there of desire and what is considered righteous behavior. And then I think in the Quran, after the story, or in the middle maybe of the story of Joseph and Zuleika, there's other women that are involved, right? That they end up kind of gossiping about her, and she responds to them. And so it's couched in, like what you said, Stephanie, about the end of Genesis and God orchestrating this, but it's also couched in these stories of women in both texts on either side. That brings in some very complicating dynamics too, in terms of gossip.
Right. So it's real, and I find this kind of funny, but it's it's amazing that this detail is put into the Quran, that, to what Rachel was saying, that, maybe he was brought in as a slave, for her to, conceive, and, if he couldn't, this Potiphar person or this minister person couldn't conceive. But it's interesting, because when they run to the door and the husband is at the door, and she says, what's going to be the punishment for this person, and the whole shirt thing. And as soon as he finds out that the shirt is ripped from the back and the wife is lying, he does say that, the way he dismisses it, it's like, you women, you're conniving, and you have your shrewd ways. So he just kind of lets it go. So nobody's punished at the time. And the Quran talks about that, of course, this news leaks, and all the other elite ladies are talking about this gossip of, Zuleika, or this woman seduced a slave boy, and this and that, and they're talking about it. So what she does is she invites all of them over for a feast. She invites them over and gives them, like fruit and stuff, and gives each a knife. And then they're like, probably, it just says that she gives them each a knife. So I'm imagining, there's like this whole feast, and they're all sitting around, paring their apples or pears or whatever. And then she asks Yusuf to come and enter the room. And the Quran says that as he enters, he is so well-formed, or, beautiful, or, good looking, that the women just, they cut their hands. And it's in the Quran that they cut their hands. So, you have to imagine, like, all these women are like just mesmerized by the beauty of this person. And Zuleika then tells them that he's the boy, he's the slave boy. So she kind of proves her point that, you all, like, lost your senses. So can you blame me for losing mine? It's funny that way, that, she not only leaves it alone, the matter at that time, but, she kind of builds her case that, wouldn't you be desiring him?
Well, and I love that addition to this story, which is not in the text that I have. So it's a fun thing to think about. And I also love this conversation about thinking about how the texts that are around a text affect our interpretation of it. And from Rachel pointing out that Tamar was the story right before this text, I'm actually really curious of Rabbi Tamar, since it's your namesake, does that story in Genesis 38 affect how you read Genesis 39 as you see these two women side by side? Is that a part of something that you have studied or thought about before?
I haven't really thought about that particular juxtaposition. I think in part because, honestly, Potiphar's wife is not somebody I've given a lot of thought to. Mm-hmm. I'm obviously familiar with the story. I think know the story well, but I'm always focused on Joseph. And that's not because Joseph's a man. I'm very interested in women in the Torah, but I think that I've always been interested in Joseph's development because he's one of our patriarchs, kind of. Not actually. But he's the son of a patriarch. Okay, mm-hmm. So one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and so a major character in our tradition. So I haven't thought that much about Potiphar's wife as a character and as a person. So that's part of what's exciting to me about this conversation is getting to
Well, it makes me curious of the juxtaposition, as Rachel brought up, the desire is bad being a way that this story was framed for her, and in the case of Tamar, there's an assertiveness that's seen as righteous.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Tamar is not, but for Tamar, it's not about desire. It's not about sexual desire, right? It's about, well, it's about a number of things. I don't know if I'd say it's about desire per se, right? I think Tamar is in a very difficult position. She, as a woman in that time without a husband, she doesn't have any financial stability, right? So there's that. She also doesn't have any future. She doesn't have, I think she wants to have children, but she also wants to carry forward her husband's line, and she doesn't have any means of doing that because Judah has put her in this terrible position where she can't, she can only marry one of his sons, but he won't let her marry his son. And so, I think Tamar is considered righteous because she's trying to do the right thing by her husband who has died, and also, unfortunately, kind of, fulfilling a woman's role at that time, right? Like a woman's role was to have children, and so she was making sure that happened. Potiphar, I don't know, it's hard to view her generously, really. I mean, it seems like she's taking advantage of Joseph and motivated by her own interests. And I agree that, sexual desire is not a bad thing in any shape, manner, or form, but the power dynamics make this a little icky, I would say.
Well, I mean, it's that space where, like, if in my modern living, I want the text to do something different. I want it to, like, I don't want the female to be the person who's doing something that is awful to another human. But, like, that's part of the story. But I actually, if I can pull back a little bit about, like, the gender nuances of things, it is something to notice, though, for how I think there is resonance for folks who have experienced traumatic things like this. And then to also have the feeling of whether you were believed or not believed, and then prison to be the next space of, like, even more oppression after something like this has happened, when you're already in an oppressed position of slavery. I think there's something in the text and the layers of that that acknowledges the pain and just the difficult things that happen when we do have the power dynamics, desire, and who ultimately pays a price for those activities.
Well, and I think maybe that beauty of multiple versions of those kinds of stories happening in the texts and giving people representation. And perhaps this story allows a different level of representation when maybe you've been harmed by someone who identifies as female, and that's in the text too. And maybe that is a different sort of space to have exist for you that wouldn't be there otherwise. And so I would love to keep talking for another hour, but it's actually time to wrap up. And so I would love to wrap up by just having each of us share, sometimes in our, what we call scripture circles, we'll share what we call a takeaway. So it's something that you want to remember or maybe think about or do based on the conversation. And I think it'd be lovely to share a takeaway. What comes to my mind is probably a takeaway. I've got questions. I think I'm going to take away a question. I just have to choose which one. But something that you would want to remember or want other people to remember or hear as we close this conversation about this section of text. So maybe let's go, if we don't mind, just going in the kind of same order we started with Alia first. What would you want to take away from this conversation?
So it's interesting. I initially wanted to take away something else, but now, after listening to everybody, I think I want to share, right after this whole scenario about the women and all, and what Lisa was talking about, that how Yusuf chose, jail rather than, the other oppression. So how do you decide, like, one oppression to other? And he says, "My Lord, I would rather be in jail than do what they invite me to." And if you do not turn their cunning away from me, I might yield to them and fall into ignorance. So I'm really humbled that somebody, in that situation would choose the jail as an oppression, or, and we have to understand, like, prison back then was like really like dungeon. But he would still rather choose that over giving into these women, all of them who who were inviting him to do something else. So I'm just humbled by this take of an oppressed person, and how sometimes they have to choose between one oppression over the other.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about how in my tradition there's not as much emphasis on sort of like, this is the takeaway from this story, right? Like this one takeaway that you're supposed to have from the story. And that we read these stories every year. Next year at this time, we'll read it again. And each time I learned something new. And it was really fascinating to get to hear from Alia and Rachel about how the story has been understood in the traditions that you've learned it in. Just really fascinating, because so of all the interpretations I've heard of this story, I hadn't ever heard one that said, "Oh, this is meant to teach us how not to behave like Potiphar's wife." So that was really interesting to hear. And I actually haven't read it in the Quran, so I didn't know how extensive it was and all the extra detail that's in there. Beautiful, so interesting. Now I want to go read it.
Yeah, I feel like I have tried so hard to redeem Potiphar's wife and sort of rethink this issue of desire. But I really appreciate what you said, Rabbi Tamar, that there's still something icky about this because of that power dynamic. There's still something unsettling about the story. And I think because of that gender reversal in the power dynamic of Joseph being the one who's enslaved instead of a woman, that it makes us ask different questions about the text. And so I still want to wrestle with that and continue to grasp in different ways what it might mean. But it's just interesting that role that the gender roles play in this story and how we interpret it. And then I also really like thinking about the stories on both sides. I'm thinking about on both sides in terms of before and after in the Hebrew scriptures and the Quran, of Tamar before and the women after, and how they both have these different things they could add to thinking about desire. Like in the Quran of her saying, "How could I not? Look at how you are also mesmerized by this man." And then with Tamar and having her kind of righteous, like you said, it's not necessarily desire, but there's something about the children and the progeny and the economic dynamic for her in there that is still related to desire. So I want to keep thinking about that. I think it all comes down to desire for me and wrestling with that.
Thank you.
I have a lot of things that I'm thinking about. But I think I think it's fascinating that there was such a clearly thought out way to figure out who was lying by looking at which way the shirt was torn. That was a fascinating detail for me, and to just think about that, like, it's interesting. And I also, like, as soon as Rabbi Tamar said about fearing God, I immediately thought, oh, then the next level is about trusting God. And so, like, it's interesting too to think about the development of like character for Joseph. And of course there's a protagonist that's a woman. That's part of like, I'm like, oh yeah, that's good storytelling. Also, so like I'm thinking about those things right now.
Yeah, so much. I think I'm really curious about. I feel like the unanswerable question is why why this is in all of the texts is just fascinating to me, or just it feels like a lot of airtime and a lot of detail for the story. So I'm still kind of just holding that question of what is there to kind of hear and learn from in that. And I do think maybe thinking about that representation piece and all of the role reversals that continue to exist in text, to look at that and how that kind of helps us see ourselves, no matter what our background is, that there's probably somebody that has that representation for us, and that the story adds to that. So thank you all so much for being here today, listeners. We'll have little links in our show notes with more with bios of the people who are here, ways to learn more from them and connect with them. So we encourage you to check out our show notes. And thank you all so much for this great conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical texts so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40, that's 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by Les FM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.